Today's Excel how-to video is going to be covering section 3.3, other data visualization methods. In this section, we talk about how to incorporate a third or fourth or additional variables into a visualization. The first type we're going to discuss is what to do when you have two numerical variables and you would like to incorporate data from a third categorical variable. In order to do this, we're going to go to the birth life worksheet in the chapter 3 data. So let me right click down here. We're going to go to the birth life. In this data set, what we're going to do is create a scatter plot using life and expectancy and birth rate. So for that, I'm going to select these two columns and I'm going to, actually, I can just select the data because it's a little bit cleaner to do it this way, and the data isn't so big that that's a problem. So I'm going to go insert and I'm going to come over and we're going to do what we did before in the previous video. We're going to just make a scatter plot. And as I talked about this in class, that there's a problem right off the bat here with the axis. So let's fix that first. I'm going to format this axis to start at 45 instead of 0, so that we get a nice sandwiching of our data. Then the other thing that we're going to do is go ahead and give this axis titles. The x-axis is the life expectancy, and this is in years. And the y-axis is the birth rate. Sorry, let me just click on here and type. So this is the, oops, that's not going to let me do it that way, is it? Let me go up here. So this is the birth rate, and this is in percent. Okay. And I think I'm going to get rid of the title because the title isn't really adding anything. So remember, we want to keep things as streamlined as possible. The other thing that when I look at this, I kind of find that my eye wants to see a trend, and sometimes the grid distracts from that. So I'm going to go in the chart design option. I'm going to go to this quick layout, and I'm going to come down to the second one on the left, which is called layout 4. It is actually getting rid of the horizontal axis I just typed in, isn't it? Let's see if we have another option that's similar, but gives me more what I want. Not really seeing it. Oh, yeah. So I could have started with this one and then added in what I wanted, but I'm going to stay with how it is. And instead, the grid lines. That's what I meant. So let's get rid of the grid lines. So this is much more like a useful graph, scatter plot that we can try and see if we see a trend. The other thing now that we want to do is introduce this third variable, the development variable. And I've sorted it already, well, not me, but it's already been sorted. If it wasn't, I would need to, into the values of this variable. And what we're going to do is introduce it into this scatter plot as color. So we're going to differentiate these blue dots depending on if the data is coming from a developing country or a developed country. Introducing color is great if your categorical variable only has 3, maybe 4 values. I would say 3, preferably 3 or less. This one has 2, so it's a good candidate for doing this. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is come over here. We're going to select the chart and come up here to chart design. And we're going to come and select the data. And under select the data, we're going to come in here and we are going to add series to this data. Basically, what we're going to do is let Excel know that we have 2 data sets that we're going to graph on top of each other, if you will. The first one's going to be called developing. And I could have just typed the word developing, but I'm just quickly trying to grab that word. So I've selected that cell. For the X values, though, I'm going to get all the X values where the developing is the value for development variable. And then for the Y, it does this equal $sign thing. So I don't want to do that. I want to delete it. And I'm going to select the birth rates where the development variable says developing. And I'll say, OK. So now it's added that. Notice that because I started this entire scatter plot choosing all the data, it's called that first series of data birth rate, and I can actually get rid of that. Now I'm going to add another one. And if you notice, the scatter plot dropped that initial data because it doesn't see it any longer. I'm not selecting it. So now I'm going to add the second series of data, which is called developed. And its X values are coming from here. And its Y values, again, we have to delete this out and pick the birth rate. And we'll hit OK. And now you see that we have both types of, all of the data is now appearing, both developing and developed. So we'll say OK here. And what we're going to do is come in here and we want to give this a legend now. So let's go down and pick legend. And we can either put it on the right the way it's there, or we can select a different location for it. I'm going to put it at the bottom like this. And either one works. And you could even go left. Some people put it at the top. Maybe the top is a good way because that's actually what we're sort of highlighting here. Now, the choice of the color is also, of course, available for editing. So I'm going to, if I choose even one of these dots, it's going to choose all of them. And I'm going to make these under format. I'm going to choose to have these be blue. Then we're going to go to these little gray ones and I want to make these orange. So let me go in and make these orange. And now we have the scatter plot set up in a way that we can see if there is a difference between the developing or the developed countries regarding the trend that we see between life expectancy and birth rate. And what we see is it appears as if these are highly correlated, and also the trend seems to be independent on whether it's developing or developed as a country. And that is information. Even though you say, oh, there's no difference, that the fact that there is no difference is actually information. It's telling you that this is a trend that holds regardless. In fact, let's get a measure of that correlation. So let's look at that correlation coefficient from this sample of data between life expectancy and the birth rate. And that correlation coefficient is going to be obtained. So this is a little bit of a review of the correlation. Now remember, correlation does not imply causality. We're just saying that these tend to trend the same. Oops, so I want to give one variable, comma, and then the data for the second variable. Okay, and we get that it's negative 0.899, and let's go down to 2 decimals is usually where we want to go. So we see a very strong, I would call this a very strong negative correlation. Okay. The next thing what we're going to do is we're going to talk about making a bubble plot. And for a bubble plot, we're going to use the same data, but we're now going to relate life expectancy and birth rate with the gross national index. And we do see that there is actually a very, very tight correlation that we see just by looking at the data between developing and developed countries. In fact, we would almost say the GNI is a number that in some way is reflecting the development, right? So it's a way to quantify what we mean by development, or it's one of the metrics that we would use in coming up with this label. So to include 3 numerical variables in the same plot, a good way to do that is a bubble plot where we choose to make one of the variables the one that will drive the size of the bubbles. So we could, in order to put that in, I'm going to insert a blank chart, basically. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to choose from the scatter plot and bubble plot, I'm going to choose a bubble chart. And if you want to make it fancy, we could do a 3D bubble. Not that that matters too much, but put that in here. And now we have a blank chart. Once we have this blank chart, The reason we want to do it this way just kind of is the fastest way to choose what we want for the variable, the numbers that are going to drive the size of the bubble. So we'll come in here and we're going to select data. And I'm going to add. And because I chose a bubble plot, it automatically gives me this X, Y, and bubble size. So let's say I want to call this, I don't know, what do we want to call it? We want to call it GNI influence. And so for our X variable, X values, we're going to just, in order to kind of continue the thought and not make the reader have to rethink everything, we're going to basically make the same scatter plot we did previously. So we're going to have life expectancy be this data on the, I meant the x-axis. So you don't want to start flipping things on people because then they have to think a lot and they lose interest in what you're trying to tell them. And for the birth rate, we will go with the y-axis. So we're going to keep those two the same. And now the only difference is for the size series bubble size, this needs to be numerical. We're going to go with the gross national index and we will say, okay. And once we have that, we'll just say, okay, there. So now you see we've created this bubble plot and we are able to, once again, notice that before we go much further, that we have this issue with the x-axis. So, and we have these bubbles. And now we can come up here and we can actually change the bubble type. I like this one actually. It really captures the bubble sizes. So we can see that the influence of the gross national index on the kind of overlaid on this relationship between, and we might want to add our axes back in here, which is a little bit more work. But let's say we want to do that. We would say on the growth rate, and I'm just going to put it in without the units. Usually if you did anything formal, you would definitely need units on here. I'm just doing this quick. Okay. Just to see what's going on. So a lot of times when you're kind of in that exploratory data analysis mode and you're making graphs and you're trying to find something, you just make something really quick. But before you actually include it in anything that would be outward facing, that means facing a client, facing the public, facing your boss, you would want to go in and fix everything and add units, for example. Okay. To do a heat map, the way I showed it in class was that we first had to build a contingency table, and we're going to do that using the bookstores data set. And what we're going to do is start by creating a pivot table, which is how we create that contingency table. So we're going to select bookstore and book type and hit insert, hit pivot table. And we're going to put in an existing worksheet. I'll just put it right here. So here we get our template by which we're able to build our contingency table. We're going to put the bookstore on the rows and the book type on the columns. And then we're going to need something to fill this in. So what we're going to do is just use the book type, and it's going to give me a count of that. So we see the counts here of each of the types of books according to each store. So we did this in class. We got rid of the blank. And then what I showed you was that it frequently just the numbers themselves aren't that useful. So we might want to switch this over by going to show value as, and we're going to do, maybe you have to order inventory for each store. So maybe you would want the percentage of the row total. So you know what is the bigger sellers by store, depending on where they're located. And we certainly don't like this crazy number of decimals. So let's go over here and just bring this down to no decimals. And just for making it easier to visualize, I'm going to also put it centered. And if you wanted to make a nice table, of course, the other thing you could do is just set all your column widths to be the same. Let's try 30 here. That was too much. Let's try something else. Let me try 15. All right, that looks a little more reasonable. Okay, and then if we want to make this a heat map, I selected just the inside part of the cells. And I go up here to conditional formatting. I'm going to go to color scales. And you can play around with different ones that may give you more or less information depending on what your objective is. I'm just going to highlight the red, white, green color scale. Again, like I said, there's many other options, but I'm going to highlight this one. And notice that what it's doing, actually, that's not the one I wanted. I wanted the one that green is the on the high end. Let me pick the other one, sorry. So green is on the high end. So the highest percentage of anything is romance in store 2. And the lowest percentage of anything is the darkest red, and that is romance at store 3. Now, if I'm actually interested in determining and using a heat map to guide me for inventory, I actually want this by store. So there's a different way to do this. I'm going to just select the row, and I'm going to do one row at a time, but I only need to do it once. So I'm going to go to the top row for store 1, and I'm going to choose that same color scale, but just on that top row. Now you notice the heat map's a little different. It's by row. So there's different ways to do heat maps, and it's really depending on what your intent is for the heat map. So for store 1, I'd say, okay, I'm going to order a few more of the travel guides and less of the self-help. So if I want to copy this formatting now to each of the other rows, I'm going to select, I'm going to highlight and select the format painter and then just pick the first cell of each row. And I can either slide over and pick format painter, or I can right click and I'll get this little shortcut to the format painter. I pick the paintbrush and I come down to the next row. And so by doing that, I'm able to get each row has its own color scheme going from lowest to highest just relative to that row. So I am able to go by bookstore, because I did it by row, and decide for that bookstore what's the highest seller and what's the lowest sellers. Okay. The next kind of contingency table, and the one I actually was talking about in classes where we have 2 variables and we use a numerical third variable to put together the heat and the colors in the heat map. So I'm going to go to bookstore 2 to show you how to do that. We're going to basically do the same thing. We're going to choose bookstore and book type. And this time I'm going to have this third variable, which is books, which is the number of books that have been sold, I don't know, some made up period, let's say in the past month, of that type at that store. So I'm going to select those 3 and I'm going to insert a pivot table here. And now I'm going to build my contingency table or my pivot table the same way I just got done doing. So I'm going to put the bookstore on the rows. I'm going to put the book type on the columns. But now instead of having it count how many of the categorical variables there were, I'm going to actually have it put in the number of books in each one of these categories. And it's going to sum up the books for me. As I kind of briefly look through this, it appears as if there are no duplicates. So sum is fine for us for right now. And let's go in here and take out those blanks. Okay. And here we see that we have some missing values, and that's fine. And we can once again also convert these values to be the percentage, and maybe what we would like for the total is maybe you're going to order for this one, you're going to make inventory. You need an inventory across all the stores. You're going to distribute it, using the previous pivot table, you'll distribute it by stores. But right now we're just going to look overall, what are the best sellers that we have. So what we are going to want to look at is the percentage. So we took the sum, but we want the percentage that those sums are. And this time we'll do it of the grand total, because once again, we just kind of want it overall. So now that we have these values, let's go ahead and format these values to be no decimals. Oops, it's not going to let me do it that way. And let's center them so they're a little easier to read. And let's make this table have consistent width. So I'm going to put again 15. That appears like a decent spread. And we will go ahead and do a heat map of this table. So this time I'm going to go color scale, and I'm going to try and see what happens with this from red being very low numbers to green being very high numbers. We obtain a slightly different heat map. Overall, we see that 6% is the highest of any one cell, and it's showing up in store 3. And we have a bunch that are not really selling at all. So we can use that to make some decisions regarding that. And let me get rid of this template now so we can more accurately see our heat map. Okay, and that's the end of the material we covered from section 3.3.